Kelowna has really coming into its own now. You know, when I was growing up here in high school, the first thing everybody wanted to do was get out. And, you know, yes, it was beautiful, but there was not much going on. There were no jobs for you when you left high school. There wasn't much post-secondary. So everybody left.
Welcome to Kelowna Talks, where we explore the why behind the decisions that shape your city. Together, we open the curtain and dig deep into current issues, plans, and policies that come out of City Hall. Thanks for joining us as we talk about Kelowna and the topics that matter to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Bob Evans, Partnership Director at the City of Kelowna and host of your Kelowna Talks podcast. I acknowledge that our community is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Syilx, Okanagan people. So, two words are appearing a lot in the media lately. Housing crisis. Dun 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 dun. We've seen housing prices escalate significantly in the region over the past couple of years. We've seen a shift in where people want to live, with people moving from big cities to smaller cities and more rural areas. It's obviously complicated. There are a lot of factors at play. A recent community trends report to council was called Housing Unaffordability, Crisis or Crossroads. And it looked at the steep rise in real estate prices and how this affects housing affordability for Kelowna residents and how the city can help through policy. Today, we're chatting with James Moore, our long-range policy planning manager, to talk about housing and specifically infill housing and what that is to us. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to sit across the floor from you.
Pleasure to have a conversation with you today.
So tell us a little about yourself, James. We like to start these things off on a little more informal basis and just get to know who you are. And when you're not thinking of policies, what do you do for fun?
That's actually, it turns out that's all I do. I actually just sit in a large library surrounded by scrolls and books and think only about policy. No, I would say, you know, I always think, what do I do when I'm not at work? And I feel like I'm a boring guy, but in the pandemic days, I'm probably more like the normal person. I binge Netflix and try to get as much exercise as I can and play with my daughter and my wife and I are also big wine lovers. So
ooh, nice.
And we were wine lovers before the pandemic. So I'm going to claim that
you've deepened that love over the pandemic.
We've become more connected to our love of wine during the course of the pandemic. But yeah, so we're a busy young family having lots of fun.
Good, thanks. I guess the other fact that I'd like to share is that, from my understanding, you grew up in Kelowna.
Yeah, that's right. Both my wife and I did. My wife actually has third generation in Kelowna.
Oh wow, interesting.
And but yeah, we both grew up here, and it's certainly a different city than when we were growing up.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to segue into. It's obviously you've seen a lot of changes in your time in Kelowna, and it's one thing to grow up as a young boy and then a man, and then go away to university. I assume you went away to university for your degrees and to come back and then work as a long-range policy planner for the city. What do you say about that? What have you noticed? What's the biggest I guess takeaway for you as a planner growing up in Kelowna?
You know, it's just I think Kelowna has really coming into its own now. You know, when I was growing up here in high school, the first thing everybody wanted to do was get out. And you know, yes, it was beautiful, but there was not much going on. There were no jobs for you when you left high school. There wasn't much post-secondary. And so everybody left. And some of us are coming back now. But now that, you know, that choice isn't the same choice being made by a lot of young people here anymore. There's lots more opportunity, both on the educational front and also on the job front. So it's just and it's also get that critical mass of people now where there's enough interesting stuff going on, enough things to do, that it's become a really, I think, a community that's hitting its own stride now. So it's just fascinating to getting a chance to be in my position, and so fortunate to be in my position while the city is at that point in its evolution.
Yeah, and one thing I always like to talk about is the advent of the UBC Okanagan campus. And, I was here when it started, and just saying to people, just hold on, because you have no idea what impact a university campus will have on our community.
Yeah, I totally agree. And students bring so much life to a city, and I can't wait to see what the downtown campus does to downtown in the next few years. And things like the international airport and so on have had such a big effect on Kelowna over time. And it's just been a pleasure to be part of that process as it's growing.
Okay, let's get back over to the housing crisis. It's such a serious topic for us today. It permeates the conversation around our dinner table, in my friend group, at the office. We're not the fastest growing city in Canada. We're probably one of the top, but we're not necessarily the fastest. And in a broad sense, how does this impact housing and housing prices? I know that's a big, hairy question, but how did we get here?
I think if I had a concise answer for that, I think I would be eligible for some serious awards. I can certainly echo your sentiment. I think now more than ever, I'm observing housing affordability as the topic of conversation, and it's not. When I was growing up here, that just wasn't the case. That's not something that people were really worried about, was whether their kids would be able to come back to live here. Whether they could afford to live here. That wasn't really a big question. It was more about if you could find a job here. And now it's water cooler talk. It's everywhere. It's the number one point of conversation in Kelowna is real estate prices. Certainly Kelowna's fast growing, but there's no way, I think, people are going to be scratching their heads about what's really behind price increases like we've seen over the past year, over the pandemic, 30% in a year. I think we're talking really about kinds of price escalation that have never before been seen in Canada. And I don't know. I think we'll be spending a lot of years dissecting all the various factors behind it. Housing markets are complex at the best of times. In a time like this, they're extra complicated. Certainly, Kelowna is fast growing, and I think when you get down to it, it's a rapidly growing place that a lot of people want to live in, and it's getting more and more unaffordable, and that's going to have real effects for people. It's not an academic discussion anymore. It's getting down to having meaningful impacts on people's livelihoods and their families.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the word that I'll hang on that you said is complex. And it really is. There are so many different variables at play. And personally, I've done lots of reading and trying to dig deep and look at the conversation that's happening in both academic and industry. And it's a head scratcher. And I think that's what's happening in the industry, in the marketplace is, there's demand and people are building homes, and demand comes price escalation. It's sort of your normal economic cycle, but it's also what it's creating in its wake that's concerning and problematic.
I think when you can say the idea that a benchmark price for a house in Kelowna would be over $1 million seemed like a fantasy, some kind of far-flung idea that would maybe happen in Vancouver at some point, but never in Kelowna. Not only have we gotten there at all, we've gotten there much faster than we thought we would. And I think it just highlights to me when something like the benchmark price for a detached home crosses $1 million, it's kind of almost a watermark. It just highlights that we've got a real deep affordability problem here, where if you're talking about it costing over $1 million for a benchmark detached home, well, that puts it out of reach for something like 90% of Kelowna residents.
Wow. That's a number, that's for sure. 90%, yeah.
And that's made even more complicated when you start thinking about, okay, well, that's the kind of form of housing that makes up most of our neighborhoods. And not only does it make up most of our neighborhoods today, but it's really all that's allowed in most of our neighborhoods. And so we're saying, in some ways, what we're realizing as a result of the kind of real estate market today and the housing crisis that we're in today, that we've got neighborhoods that at some point in the not too distant future are only going to be accessible to, 10% or fewer of residents. They're really going to be for only the wealthy. And that poses kind of an existential problem for us about how do we accommodate our future nurses and our future teachers and our future service sector workers and our future tradespeople in housing that is affordable for average people.
Well, and that segues into infill housing, which is my next topic I wanted to talk to you about. And as you're aware, we're projected to grow by 40,000 people in the next 20 years. And we're obviously hedged in with a beautiful landscape of mountains and lake. And then we have the agricultural land reserve. So it's a tough thing. We have to put people somewhere. So now we're talking about density. And one of the things that you're in charge of at City Hall is infill and the infill challenge. So when I use the word infill, not everybody understands what that means. So just to start us off, can you explain in simple terms what infill is?
Well, I'm trying not to talk about infill because I just like for this very reason, because I think it's a term that doesn't necessarily immediately resonate with you. I try and talk about housing choices or housing options, and I think when we look at our neighborhoods, we often don't have much housing choice. Many of us grew up in neighborhoods that really just had detached homes in them as our one option. But there's a whole menu of options of housing forms and homes that can exist in those kinds of neighborhoods, whether it's carriage houses or suites or duplexes or houseplexes or small apartment buildings. These kinds of homes that can fit into our existing neighborhoods, but that really are affordable and attainable to a much broader cross-section of the city than a simple detached house.
So we're talking back to economics again, I guess, when we're talking about taking a simple single-family lot and then adding more people on it through the housing form that you're adding to that particular property. Is that?
Yeah, and I think it does a couple of things. It expands the kinds of housing options that exist in a neighborhood, not just from an affordability perspective. So that's one big advantage. It's a person. More people can access a townhouse than can access a detached house. More people can access a secondary suite than can access a detached house. So that's one part of it. But there's also the piece about if you're a homeowner and you're concerned about whether you can accommodate where your kids might live, it might give you the chance to change the configuration of homes on your lot so that maybe there's a smaller place that you can think about aging in place in, and maybe you can provide a home for one of your kids or more than one of your kids. Maybe it's a rental for when they're in college. Maybe it's a place for them to have their starter home, and maybe it's their permanent home. But it starts to mean that our neighborhoods can offer housing that meets our needs at different points in our lives, not just when we have a big family.
Okay, and you've been thinking about this for a number of years, and you and your department started something called the Infill Challenge. Can you tell us a little bit about that, what it was, and now that it's been in place for a while, how that turned out compared to your vision, and how's that looking on the ground, James?
So we did start the Infill Challenge, and we were actually just wrapping up the second round of that, the Infill Challenge 2.0, and both of them really asked put a challenge out to the design community, whether that's designers or architects or home builders, to bring forward their best ideas for how you could accommodate new forms of housing or new homes in neighborhoods in a way that would be economically feasible, but that would also respect those neighborhoods. And the first Infill Challenge identified a couple of design options, and we thought it was an interesting process, and one of the takeaways for me was that we host a lot of conversations in that process with residents and builders and designers, and when you come from the development process like I did, you're used to a very kind of expecting a lot of conflict between developers and neighborhoods. It's kind of a narrative that you're very used to seeing. And I didn't see that in this process. I saw a lot of actually a lot of agreement and a lot of consensus, and that stuck with me. That I don't think we're quite as far apart as people think we are when it comes to infill. But anyway, we thought it was an interesting process, and that might find some uptake, but probably not a lot. It would be an interesting idea that we could explore and use as a pilot. And we took those winners and we gave them some incentives and said, hey, let's see if we can make this easy to deliver these winning designs in our neighborhoods. And lo and behold, it took off. And I think looking around, it's probably one of the most successful infill programs in the country. If you think about it in terms of how many have been delivered and how many homes have been delivered to market. And that means on the ground, we're seeing in a lot of central neighborhoods, we're seeing 4-unit projects where there used to be 1 unit or maybe 2 units. And those 4 units might be in all attached. They might be 4 townhomes. They might be 2 detached homes and 2 condo units behind, or any combination of those. So you're not talking about a major, huge transformation neighbor. This is not a tower next to a detached house or a giant apartment building. These are small homes that fit on a standard lot, and they're adding diversity to and housing options to neighborhoods that maybe haven't seen investment in quite a long time.
But there's certainly been impact. I mean, it's just driving around the city now and going into the older neighborhoods. There's all of these units popping up in primarily the old-fashioned single-family neighborhoods. So that probably hasn't been easy for a lot of people in the neighborhoods who are used to just having the single-family homes. And I know it's needed. What do you say to people who are living in those neighborhoods that have been there for decades and are seeing their neighborhoods transforming to have more people? So more people brings more traffic, more noise, more action. How do you just, I guess, win them over is the only phrase I can think of, to the value of that? And how do you explain to them what's happening in their neighborhood and why we need to do that as a city?
I will say right off the bat that it has been less contentious than almost any other similar program in the country. Usually when you hear about programs like this, they're in the news because they're in court, or they're massive protests or something like that. That hasn't been the case here. That's not to say that there aren't people who are concerned and who've expressed those concerns to me and to council and others. And I think one of the ways, and some of those concerns are things we have to work on. Like, there's no way that we were going to do that program and have it be perfect right off the bat. Sure. It is a learning process. And, I like to think about infill as a learning process. It's something you're going to have to, it's not a one and done thing. You're going to have to stay committed to it and to keep it up to date and to keep it relevant and to keep it listening to the community and doing better and doing better and doing better all the time. It's a commitment to a process, not a one-time outcome. But I think one of the ways that is starting to bear fruit in terms of talking to people about infill is about their own families. When you have to pull people a little bit out of their own context to say, we all love our neighborhoods. We all love our neighborhoods the way they are today. Maybe we've been there for a long time and we love that tree on the corner. We're used to the neighborhood exactly the way it is. And so talking about change in that neighborhood, no matter what form that change makes or takes, is a difficult thing to have. And I think you have to appreciate that. You have to appreciate the people are value their neighborhoods. They value the relationships. They value the places, and that's something you want to respect and acknowledge. But it helps to take people a little bit out of that and say, okay, where if you have children, if you have grandchildren, if you have nieces and nephews, where are they going to live? when it's their turn to get a piece of the pie in Kelowna. We all want our children and grandchildren, nieces and nephews or relatives to be able to enjoy our neighborhoods the same way we did. But when getting in that neighborhood is going to take you over $1 million, there aren't that many of them are going to be able to do that the way our neighborhoods are today. So it helps to start talking to people about, okay, well, where are our children going to live? And how can we make it so that our children and grandchildren can access the neighborhoods that we love in a way that they can afford? And so I think that's a fruitful conversation. I'm not going to say that everybody comes out of those conversations happy or fully satisfied, but I think it's a way to start having people step away from their feelings about their neighborhood today and think a bit more about how we find room for people in the future. And I think also talking about that, how do you plan on growing and aging in place in this space? Do you think you're going to want to be able to live in your home when you're 80 and maybe you have a mobility challenge? Should you be able to live in your home when you're 80 and you have a mobility challenge? Should you be able to build something on your property that you can move into that is more, that meets your needs at that point in your life? Should you be able to build a place for your kids to come live while they come and get established in Kelowna? And I think those kinds of questions are questions that prompt meaningful discussion rather than where are people going to park their cars and, why is anything having to change? Like you gotta step away from those basic conversations and get people thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, and the price change, I was gonna say ceiling. It's definitely not a ceiling. It's just the foundation now, the $1 million average, and that has spurred the conversation on, because there are people me, I have 3 quote unquote kids who are now in their 20s and they'd love to come to Kelowna, and we start looking around and we try to figure out, okay, how does that look? What would that be like? Where could you live? So those are conversations that are happening. So generationally, you're right. We want people to be able to live in our city, and how are we going to make that happen?
I think there's also there's a narrative that exists that neighborhoods don't have to change, or that neighborhoods can somehow freeze themselves in time. And I think that's just you have to start to get ourselves out of that idea, because it's not the truth. It's not what happens. So really, I think when you look at infill, you have to look at a couple of broad futures for a neighborhood. And one is roughly the status quo, where we predominantly allow mostly detached homes in most of our neighborhoods. And what's going to happen in those neighborhoods over time is that people will come in and they'll buy those $1 million homes and they'll knock them down, and they'll build, because they can't build anything else, they'll build a $3 million home. They'll build a brand new, larger, more expensive home. And those neighborhoods will become even more exclusive. And the alternative is, okay, well, let's think about ways we can add additional units to those neighborhoods, get some benefits of those additional units. Maybe that's better transit access, maybe that's some local services, all those kinds of things. But also provide housing that isn't that $3 million new house. It's a mid-market townhouse, or something along those lines that a much broader cross-section of the community could actually access. And so, I think it's not about whether change is going to occur. That's going to happen. Our neighborhoods are going to change. The question is, what shape does that change take, and what benefits are there for our future generations?
Perfect segue to my next question that came to mind. I'm a designer by training, so what shape does it take? So, your words, how does that play out in the design aesthetics for this Infill Challenge? So this Infill Challenge 2.0, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the things you're looking at inside of that challenge in terms of form, character, streetscape, all the things we like to talk about as designers that create a great project and really help these projects to blend seamlessly with the neighborhood?
Sure. And I think, first off, you have to situate the kind of change that we're talking about in scale of building in context. And, the kind of infill that the Infill Design Challenge and Infill Challenge 2.0 are talking about is very low on the scale of new development. We're not talking about a design challenge to bring in towers into a neighborhood, or we're not talking about a design challenge to bring in 8-story apartment buildings into neighborhoods. We're talking about a design challenge to that's predominantly still in the kind of 2.5 story range of buildings. So we've scaled the submissions so that they're within a very reasonable range of what can be built in those neighborhoods today. So they're not gonna, they're roughly similar to what in scale can be built in there under the existing regulations today. We also really want to make sure that they push they're very friendly to the street. So we talk about making sure that they don't turn their backs on the street, they engage with the street well, they have room for shade trees and landscaping and outdoor space, that they consider privacy not just for future residents there on the site, but also for adjacent neighbors. So there's lots of things that we do to think about the design element, about how it fits into the neighborhood. There's also lots of other design things that we think about in the design challenge that aren't related to fit, but that are equally important, about how do we manage stormwater in a way that is sustainable so that we're not creating major stormwater problems downstream. How do we think about energy efficient design that creates buildings that are sustainable for another generation or two, that don't end up being a burden? So there's lots of elements to this that are being considered, and I wouldn't want to. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that affordability was a question that we're proposing in there as well. How can infill not just be delivered at market rates, but how can it be delivered in a way that maybe is more connected to affordable incomes and average incomes in the city?
Well, that's a good point, because we can design ourselves out of the market in terms of pricing. If we overregulate it and over specify it, it just gets more expensive.
Yeah. So all those kinds of things are being considered, and we've got a great panel of judges with experience from Vancouver and locally, and all mixed together, who'll get a chance to really carefully vet all of our submissions. We've got, so far in our second design challenge, we originally got 56 submissions, which has really shocked us in a really great way. And so the jury has a big task ahead of them to look at all the designs. And I'm sure they will bring all of their expertise and knowledge and care for our community to bear, and select some winners that will present our community with some really interesting ideas about what housing might look like in our neighborhoods in the future.
So what happens with the winners?
At this stage, our first design challenge was connected to some accelerated approvals. We haven't made that commitment this time because I think we're heading into some interesting territory around design here, and we want to make sure that the outcomes that we see are the kind of quality that we want to make sure we're comfortable with and council's comfortable with. So I think we'll have discussions about how we see these being delivered in neighborhoods, whether there's an accelerated process or not. That conversation will for sure happen, but it's not guaranteed. So at this stage, we are still considering it an ideas competition. It's something that will present residents and council and staff with some great ideas that we could integrate into many of our other processes. But the possibility for sure is out there that that if all goes well, we love the submissions, the community loves them, council loves them, that we could start finding ways to accelerate their approval, and we could see them being built in our neighborhoods sooner rather than later. That possibility is out there.
Well, I think the more important thing from my perspective is just to get the ideas flowing and get them in front of the public and council, to let people understand that there's a lot of variety that can happen within our downtown neighborhoods with the delivery of these projects. So with that, getting towards the end of our time, James, another question I'd like to ask, especially of planners, if you're standing on top of Knox Mountain 10 or 15 years from now, And for people that can't see, he's closing his eyes, so he's doing some good mind picture stuff going on here.
I actually just fell asleep for a second.
Okay, sorry. It's, what do you see? What would you like to see? What does Kelowna look like? For your young family, what is I was going to use the word utopian. I don't think we'll ever get to a utopian vision, but what's a good, sustainable, healthy vision for our city?
I think, when I think about if I were to walk down a neighborhood street 15 years from now, what would I want to see? The first thing that always pops into my mind is I want to see people. There's so many neighborhoods anymore where when you arrive in them, the first thing you see is cars, and you don't really see any people. And it might take you half an hour before you see somebody walking somewhere. And so I'm hopeful that when we start to see some of our neighborhoods evolve and change and accommodate more housing choices in them, that will bring more activity, and we'll see more lively streets. We'll see kids running around and biking on their bikes, and neighbors talking and engaging with one another, people having barbecues in their yards. And so I think the first thing I want to see is people, and I also want to see green. I want to see more trees. I want to see more, I want to see more shade coming from our urban environment. I want to see more street trees that are growing in and that are making us feel like we're walking through mature neighborhoods. I also think a little bit about what I don't want to see, and I don't want to walk through a neighborhood and see. I think in some ways the mark of successful infill is that you don't really see it that much. That it's not an observable, massive change in neighborhoods. It just kind of happens, and the neighborhood slowly evolves, and it feels kind of seamless. So I hope that walking through a future neighborhood, you're not like, oh, this is an infill neighborhood. Look at all the infills here. I hope that you'd walk through that neighborhood and you'd see what a comfortable, great neighborhood to walk through. I see all these people out hanging out, being part of a community, and I feel I'm in a comfortable physical environment, and I feel great walking around, and less like, look at all these different forms of housing here. I think that should drift into the background of a great neighborhood. Well
said. And I think the ultimate test of success, as you say, is just walking through the neighborhood and feeling like it was meant to be here, and it evolved organically. So best of luck with your team and this infill challenge. I'm glad it's in your hands to steer this ship, and I fully expect and hope, fully hope, not necessarily expect, that your vision will come to fruition, because there's a lot of really good, smart people working on it, including you. So did we miss anything today, James, that you'd like to talk to us about the Infill Challenge, or other issues that are on your mind that you wanted to make sure you could get across to our listeners?
I just take another chance to just reinforce that, I think, our neighborhoods are going to change one way or another, and I hope that we can all engage in a really positive conversation about what that change ought to look like, and how we can find room for our teachers, our nurses, our average income earners, our working people in the future to be able to live in all of our neighborhoods, because we love them, and I hope that we want people in the future of Kelowna to love them too.
Well, we'll end on that. I think that that's a noble goal, and I hope we'll reach that. So thank you for your time today, James.
Thanks for the conversation. It was great.
Yep. Excellent. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Kelowna Talks. For more conversations about topics that matter in your community, subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you liked what you heard, give us a 5-star rating and share Kelowna Talks with your friends and neighbors. If you'd like more information about this podcast and other big community conversations, visit kelowna.ca/community stories.